My name is Ivan, and this story happened in 2006 when I was 29 years old and a mountain guide in the Ural Mountains. I grew up in Ekaterinburg in a simple family and spent the winters helping my father at the village sawmill, while our summers escaped to the mountains. Climbing has always been my passion, but back then I did it to pay the bills. I used to guide small groups of adventurers and occasionally took experienced climbers on challenging routes. That's how I met Alexander, a man in his 50s with white hair cut off, who hired me to lead an expedition to Mount Kailash, a mountain that had the reputation of being cursed. He seemed serious, almost obsessed, and his group of 3 other climbers seemed equally determined. I confess that I took the job more for money than enthusiasm. Mount Kailash was little explored and involved in strange stories. They said that the compasses go mad near the peak, that the winds whisper names, and that those who dared climb his face more deeply never returned to it. I always thought these stories were exaggerated, but something on the mountain was different. When we arrived at base camp with Alexander and his group, the air seemed heavier, as if the mountain was watching us. One of the team members, Yuri, who was the youngest, kept rubbing his hands even with thick gloves. "This mountain has a sound," he said, looking up as if he saw something I could not see. I laughed, trying to lighten the mood, but the truth is that I felt a shiver running through my spine. Time seemed more still there, as if we were entering another world. We went up the next day at dawn. Mount Kailash looked more imposing in the dim sunlight, with its snow-covered slopes almost glistening against the gray sky. The sound of our footsteps crushing the ice was the only thing that broke the silence, except for a constant breeze that seemed to send a distant whisper. The walk was quiet in the first hours, but from noon I started to notice something strange. My breath was heavier than normal, as if it had become denser. Alexander also worked several times, supporting his hands on the knees, saying he was feeling a pressure in his chest. Yuri complained of pain in the knees, which I found curious, considering he was the youngest and most experienced of the group. Despite all the hassles, we keep going, sure to reach the peak. When we stopped to rest, I realized that something was wrong with the watch on my wrist. He marked 3:47 p.m., but the sun was in a position that looked closer to noon. Alexander noted the same on his watch. "This place plays with time," he muttered, frowning. That's when Svetlana, the only woman in the group. We ran to her, who was looking at his hands with an indescribable dread on her face. His skin, usually rosy from the cold, looked dry and wrinkled, as if it had aged decades in a matter of minutes. She trembled so much that she almost dropped her water bottle. No one could explain what was happening, but at that moment, the air around us seemed colder, more oppressive. Alexander rushed us, saying we needed to continue before something worse happened. After that incident with Svetlana, the mood in the group changed completely. Silence that was once an ally to save energy has become an unbearable burden. Nobody spoke, but everyone looked at Svetlana of relationship, as if they feared that it could happen to them too. Yuri started to trip, but, complaining that his boots were tight, something that seemed impossible. When he took one of them to check, he saw that his feet were swollen and the skin was dark spots, almost like bruises, but in a way he had never seen before. He tried to ignore it, but I could see that he was getting slower, with his face marked by wrinkles that were not there that morning. Mount Kailash seemed sugar to the vitality of each one of us, in a subtle way, but undeniable. At nightfall, we set up camp on a narrow plateau, which was the last stop before the attack to the summit. Everyone was exhausted, but no one seemed to be willing to sleep. The feeling of discomfort was almost palpable. Svetlana insisted that her hands continued drying, showing her fingers, now with brittle nails that broke at the slightest touch. Alexander, who until then tried to keep calm, began talking about giving up and returning in the morning. It was the first time you noticed a genuine fear in your eyes. As he talked, he felt a kind of vibration on the ground, a severe buzzing that seemed to come from inside the mountain. It was not a sound exactly, but a sensation, as if something was awake. Do not know how long we were there, paralyzed, but no one could articulate a word. All looked at the top of the mountain, where a faint light, almost imperceptible, trembled. That night, no one could sleep. We all came inside the tents, trying to ignore the strange sound that seemed to pulsate at the base of the mountain. Alexander insisted on standing guard, but I knew it was just an excuse to avoid closing my eyes. When the first light came up on the horizon, we disassembled the camp in silence, almost mechanically. Yuri barely managed to carry his backpack, and his face was unrecognizable. He seemed to have aged 20 years since the day before. His skin was flabby, his eyes deep, like those of someone who had lost more than just energy. "I won't make it," he muttered, but Alexander insisted that he tried. Something inside me screamed for us to go back, but no one wanted to be the first to admit that Mount Kailash was bigger than we were. The final walk was a nightmare. The light of day seemed weaker, as if we were under a veil, and the wind now sounded like voices. Not clear words, but murmurs that justify peeking in our ears. Svetlana began to hiccup softly, saying she could not breathe. When I looked back, I saw that she was grasping her own face, as if trying to stop something from escaping from inside her. Then Yuri collapsed. He fell to his knees, coughing hard, until he stopped moving. His hair, which was dark brown, was completely white. Alexander tried to lift him, but his own hands were too formidable to do anything. I wanted to help, but felt my legs heavy, as if each step drained years of my life. Yet something on top of the hill seemed to call us, a force that was impossible to ignore. When we finally reached the last stretch before the summit, Svetlana started screaming. It was not a cry of pain, but something more primitive, as if his mind had been broken. It pointed to the horizon, where the peak of Mount Kailash should be. The top seemed surrounded by a dense mist, but in the middle of it you could see something shining, like a pulsating crystal. It was not an ordinary light. It was almost as if it were alive, changing in intensity at irregular intervals. Alexander left her by the arm, trying to shut her mouth, but she let go and started running towards the light. No one had the courage to follow her. We stood still, watching as she disappeared in the middle of the fog, the screams getting more and more distant, until they completely disappear. Alexander didn't say anything, but her expression made it clear that we knew what had happened. She wouldn't come back. The air seemed heavier, as if the mountain squeezed us, forcing us to kneel. Alexander looked at me, and something in his eyes changed. He seemed empty, as if he had given up. He turned and began to walk back down the way we came. I yelled at him to stop, but he did not react. I just kept walking. And then he realized his body was moving in a strange way, as if he were older, more fragile. His clothes were wide, and his hands looked like a man over 80. I stood there alone, staring at the ridge. My instinct was to run away, but something in the light called me. I felt like my own life depended on finding out what it was. But at the same time, I knew that if I got closer, I might never come back. I don't know how long I stood there trying to decide what to do. Every second seemed to stretch, as if the mountain was playing with time again. The sound of the wind had disappeared, replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the irregular sound of my own breath. Finally, I gathered the courage to turn around and go down. My muscles are rusty, as if they were aging along with me. As I went down, I saw Alexander further ahead, but he was unrecognizable. His body seemed to have withered, his back was bent, and he walked with wobbly steps like an old man about to collapse. I did not dare to call him. I just continued, fighting against the invisible weight that seemed pulled back. Each step took me further away from the light, and although I felt a mixture of collapse and despair, something inside me knew that that mountain would not let us leave unscathed. When I finally reached the base of the camp, Alexander was no longer there. There were only footprints that disappeared on the ice. Svetlana and Yuri were never found, and there was no official investigation, because nobody wanted to talk about Mount Kailash. When I returned to Ekaterinburg, I realized that something was very wrong with me. My reflection in the mirror showed a man who looked at least 20 years older. My skin was marked by deep lines, and my hair, which was dark brown before, now was full of white strands. I tried to explain this to the doctors, but none of them found an apparent cause. Time passed, but I can't forget that light on the ridge. Sometimes I dream of her, pulsating as if she were alive, calling for me. Even today, avoid the mountains. I still feel that somehow I left part of me in that place, and I'm afraid she's waiting for me to come back. Mysterious features and sacred meaning of Mount Kailash. My name is Lucas, and this happened in 2019 when I was traveling through Tibet as part of a cultural and spiritual expedition. At the time, I was 31 years old, working as a freelance photographer, and was in a phase of life where I was looking for experiences that would take me out of my routine. Always heard of Mount Kailash as a sacred place, full of stories and mysteries. I decided to include the mountain in my itinerary, even though it was not possible to climb it, something that local traditions forbid. The idea was to make the Kora, a pilgrimage around the mountain, which is considered an act of purification. I'm not very religious, but the idea of connecting with something bigger while documenting everything seemed fascinating. I arrived at base camp early in the morning. The cold was too cold, and the thin air made everything seem heavier. Mount Kailash has appeared on the horizon as an overwhelming presence. Its symmetry is the kind of thing that makes you doubt your eyes. It is so perfect that it seems artificial, almost as if someone had been carved. While I was setting up my camera, I noticed that my electronic equipment was strangely full. The GPS was not getting a signal, and my compass, which I always take as backup, turned wildly. I thought it was a problem with the equipment, but when I mentioned it to one of the local guides, he just suggested it and said, "That's Kailash. You get used to it." The answer was a bit discomforting, but I preferred not to question. At that moment, I found out that the most intriguing was yet to come. The walk started quietly, but the environment seemed more charged with each step. It was hard to explain, but there was something in the atmosphere that looked different from anywhere else I've been. Even with the sun shining, the sky seemed darker, as if there was a gray veil covering everything. The trail surrounded the base of the mountain, and at times it was possible to feel a vibration on the ground, as if something was pulsating inside the hill. It was not noise, it was more like a sensation, a very low hum that you feel in your chest. Some of the pilgrims who were with me began to pray in silence, mumbling words in languages I did not know. Even without being religious, I began to feel that there was something sacred there, but also disturbing. About 2 hours later, we reached a point that gave view to the two lakes near the hill. One was crystal blue, calm, almost mesmerizing. The other, beside it, was dark, with a more dense and opaque appearance, almost like oil. It was strange to see how they were so close, yet completely different, as if each belonged to a world opposite. While I was taking pictures, the camera battery started to drain quickly, even though it was fully charged in the morning. It made me angry because it was an expensive and reliable piece of equipment. At the same time, I felt a shiver running through my spine. I looked around and noticed that some people were staring at the dark lake, not moving. They seemed hypnotized, as if something was drawing them there. It started to make me nervous that I could not explain. After a while, the local guide called us to continue the walk, but I noticed that some people were hesitant, especially an older man who looked pale and restless. He stared at Mount Kailash, as if he saw something no one else could. When I asked if he was well, he replied in an almost inaudible tone, "The mountain breathes." It was disturbing, but before he could say anything, he just turned around and started to walk down the path from where we came, alone. The guide shouted something in Tibetan to him, but the man ignored. The group moved on, but the tension was evident. It was at this point that I started to feel a slight headache, the kind of discomfort that seems to be in sync with your heartbeat. Time seemed to be acting strangely. I can't explain, but it was as if the minutes were going slower as we walked. I looked at the clock and noticed that it was still, marking exactly 13:13, which made me uncomfortable because I knew we had already walked for at least an hour since the last break. The trail narrowed, and now the mountain seemed bigger than ever, almost as if it was surrounding us. Every time I looked up, I felt a feeling of vertigo, as if the mountain was leaning over us. The winds became stronger and began to carry a strange sound, like a whisper that seemed to say something indelible. I didn't know if it was my mind playing tricks or if there really was something there, but the feeling was that we were being watched. In the middle of the afternoon, we reached a higher stretch of the trail where the wind was almost sharp. The guide suggested we take a short break, but nobody seemed to relax. Then I noticed something very strange. When I looked back, the path we had come from seemed different, as if the landscape had changed. I was sure that there was a set of specific stones that I used as reference to take some pictures before, but now they were not there. I asked the guide about it, but he just shook his head and said something like, "The mountain shows you what you want to see." That gave me a shiver. I began to notice that others in the group were visibly disturbed, some whispering to each other, while others kept their gaze fixed on the ground, as if avoiding facing the surrounding environment. Shortly after, I saw something that I still cannot forget. There was a rock formation further ahead, in a curve of the trail, which seemed to pulse slightly, as if it were alive. At first I thought it was the wind moving light on the surfaces, but when I approached, I swear that I could feel a faint vibration coming from it, almost like the hum we felt at the beginning of the day. The edges of the rock looked extremely smooth, as if they had been cut with precision, and had a subtle, almost metallic sheen that made no sense there. One of the pilgrims came closer too, and when he reached out to touch the rock, it was as if time had frozen for a moment. He quickly retreated, saying something in his tongue that I did not understand, but the expression on his face was pure fright. Something inside me said we should get out of there as soon as possible. The climate began to change abruptly. The sky, which already had a grayish hue, became even darker, as if it was about to rain, but without real clouds. The air seemed heavy, almost difficult to breathe, and people started walking faster, as if they wanted to end it immediately. I was feeling strange, with a pressure in the temples and the uncomfortable feeling that something was following us. When I looked back, I saw only the emptiness of the trail we had traveled, but still could not get rid of the impression that there was something hidden waiting. It was when I heard a faint sound, almost like a groaning, coming from somewhere near the hill. I asked the guide if he had heard too, but he ignored me, rushing his step. His attitude only increased my anxiety. We got to a part of the trail that was around the hill closer, and it was there that something really scary happened. My clock, which had been stopped since midday, started working again, but it was fast-paced, with the hands spinning wildly. It wasn't just mine. I heard other people complaining about their handsets as well, saying that their compasses were completely disoriented. It was at that moment that I realized something strange. The light. The daylight seemed to be coming from a different angle, illuminating Mount Kailash in a surreal way, almost as if it was shining on its own. The mountain emitted a kind of golden and pale aura, something I had never seen before. The vision was both fascinating and terrifying, because at that moment I was sure that place did not follow the same rules as the rest of the world. Suddenly, the wind stopped completely, and silence took over the place. It was not a natural silence, but something so absolute that even my own thoughts seemed muffled. The whole group stopped. Nobody knew what to do. It was when something began to change in the air around us, like an invisible vibration that seemed to cross the body. I looked at Mount Kailash, and the golden light was now pulsating, as if the mountain were alive. I can't explain, but I felt a primitive fear, something that said I shouldn't be there. Some people began to walk away, with expressions of pure dread, and the guide, for the first time, seemed really worried. He started to shout for us to leave immediately. I didn't think twice, took my backpack, and started to go down the trail as fast as I could, without looking back. When I finally got back to base camp, I felt like I was out of a nightmare. My whole body was exhausted, but the relief of being away from that mountain was almost palpable. The guide refused to talk about what happened, only said he would never take anyone to that stretch again. After a few hours, I started to realize that some of the photos I took were strange. Some images had unexplained light spots, and others seemed distorted, as if the environment itself was crumbling. I couldn't stay longer at the camp. I took my things and returned to town on the same day. To this day, I think about what happened there. Don't know what I saw, but I know it wasn't something from this world. And honestly, I never want to get near Mount Kailash again. Mount Kailash ET Theory. My name is Raphael, and this experience happened in 2018, when I was 34 years old and was traveling through Asia looking for inspiration for a book that I never finished. I am a history teacher and have always been fascinated by ancient mysteries, especially those involving puzzles that even modern science cannot explain. When I heard about Mount Kailash, with its connection to different religions and theories of extraterrestrial origins, I knew that I needed to visit. The idea of being near a place that many consider sacred, but also full of speculation about advanced technologies you were past, it was irresistible to me. I'm not exactly skeptical, but I also never had any out-of-the-ordinary experience until that day. I arrived at the base camp on a cold morning, with thin air making even the simplest movements difficult. The view of Mount Kailash was breathtaking. It looked unlike any mountain I had ever seen, with a symmetry that did not seem natural. However, it was talking to a local guide that really caught my eye. He mentioned that at certain points along the trail, some people report seeing inscriptions on stones that seemed not to be human. I was intrigued and decided to explore on my own. He was with a small backpack, a bottle of water, and my camera, ready to capture as much as I could. I had no idea that, before the end of the day, I would deeply regret going alone. I started the trail with enthusiasm, even feeling the tiredness caused by altitude. The path was narrow and quiet, except for the sound of the wind whistling through the rocks. After about an hour of walking, I reached a stretch where the stones around had very strange marks. They were not like the rock carvings I have seen elsewhere. These were incredibly accurate, as if they had been made with some tool that cut the rock like butter. Straight lines and smooth curves formed patterns that I couldn't identify, but they seemed to be part of something bigger, like a map or code. I took some pictures, but when I went to look in the camera, the screen blinked and locked, as if something was interfering with the circuits. I thought it was the cold or the battery, but I started to feel uncomfortable. I kept walking, trying to ignore the strange feeling that had begun to grow in me. The silence around me seemed heavier now, as if even the sound of the wind had disappeared. It was when I saw something that made me stop at the same instant. A large rock in front had what appeared to be a metal plate attached to it, partially covered by moss. The material did not look like anything I had ever seen. It was not rust, it was not something aged, it was smooth, with a silver sheen that reflected light in an almost artificial way. I approached slowly, feeling my heart go up for no apparent reason. I passed the hand on the surface, and it was cold but not like a normal rock. It seemed more alive, as if it was pulsating lightly under my fingers. I knew something was wrong, but at the same time I could not move away. As I touched that metallic surface, I felt a slight hum in the air, as if something was vibrating around me. It was not just a sound exactly, but a feeling that ran through my body, especially in the hands. He instinctively backed away and looked around, but there was nothing but the rocks and the imposing mountain. It was then that I realized something even more strange. My wristwatch was stopped. I looked at the phone in my backpack, and it had also turned off, even with a full battery before starting the trail. My instinct was to get out of there, but at the same time, my curiosity was stronger. I took a stone from the ground and hit lightly on that metal surface, hoping to hear the sound of something solid. The sound that echoed was deep and hollow, almost as if there were a hidden chamber inside the mountain. My stomach turned. Before I could think of what to do, I felt a pressure in the air, something that seemed to push against me from all sides. My vision was blurred for a few seconds, as if the environment around me was shaking. When I got back in focus, something had changed. The light around was different, more intense, but in a way that did not seem natural. I looked at Mount Kailash, and I swear I saw small bright spots moving near the summit, like stars floating in broad daylight. It was impossible, but there they were, blinking and moving irregularly. My whole body was tense, and my hands trembled as I tried to understand what was happening. At that moment, I realized there was no sound. It was so absolute silence that even my thoughts felt muffled. I knew I had to get out of there, but my body felt stuck, as if something anchored me in that place. Mount Kailash had become almost oppressive, as if it was watching me. That faint buzzing I felt before started to increase, but now it seemed to come from inside my head. took my backpack and started walking back, trying to concentrate on my steps and ignore everything around. It was then that I noticed something strange on the floor. The marks I had seen before on the rocks were now scattered along the trail, as if they had multiplied, or worse, as if they were moving. They were not only drawings, they were complex patterns, almost like circuits. I was terrified, but kept walking, because standing there seemed even more dangerous. About 10 minutes later, I heard a muffled sound behind me. It wasn't the sound of wind or a rolling stone. It was like an electronic squeal, something completely out of place. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw a faint light coming from behind the same metallic rock that I had touched before. She pulsed, changing intensity, as if trying to call me back. My whole body shivered. That thing was not natural, and I knew I should not be there to find out what it was. I started running, even though the air made it hard to breathe. The trail seemed endless, and as much as I ran, the feeling of being observed did not disappear. As I ran, I realized that something strange was happening with the landscape around me. The rocks looked different, as if they had changed position or shape. For a moment, I had the feeling of walking in circles, but I knew it was impossible because I was following the same path as the way. The golden light around Mount Kailash seemed to be more intense, and I began to feel a strange heat on my face, even with the sharp cold of the environment. It was then that I tripped over a rock and fell to my knees. As I stood up, I saw something on the horizon that made my blood freeze. A silhouette, not of a person, but of something larger and undefined, seemed to be standing on top of a rock formation. She did not move, but her presence was overwhelming. Did not know if it was real or the fruit of my fear, but at that moment, everything inside me said not to look again. I kept running regardless of tiredness. My only goal was to get to base camp, but the time seemed to be distorted. I looked at the clock once more, and it still marked the same time since it stopped, as if it was stuck. When I finally saw the first tents of the camp, I felt a huge relief, but it lasted for a short time. I looked back one last time and saw that the lights that were on the ridge before now were much closer, hovering in the air as if it was following me. I can't explain what they were, but they seemed almost intelligent, moving in a way that was not random. I went into my tent, zipped up and stood there, shaking, with no courage to go out. Everything around was silent again, but the fear kept beating inside me. Stayed inside the tent for hours, without being able to sleep. The feeling of being observed did not pass, even if outside everything seems calm. Finally, when the sun started to rise, I decided to go out and see if anything had changed. Mount Kailash seemed quiet, almost serene, as if nothing had happened. The people in the camp behaved normally, preparing for the day. I tried to talk to the local guide about what I had seen, but he just smiled strangely and said, "The Kailash keeps its secrets." That made me even more uneasy. When I checked the photos I had taken the day before, many were corrupted, with stripes and stains that made no sense. The few that remained showed the marks on the stones, but the images seemed less clear than I remembered. It was as if something wanted to erase the evidence. Left the camp that day and never came back. To this day, I can't explain what happened there. I don't know what those lights were, or what that metal rock meant. What scares me most is that, every now and then when I close my eyes, I can still hear that faint tinnitus, as if it were stuck in some corner of my mind. I haven't told this story to many people because I know it sounds crazy, but I know what I saw. Mount Kailash is more than a mountain. There is something there, something that does not belong to this world. And sincerely, I hope I never cross the path of it again. The Time Riddle on Mount Kailash. My name is Michael, and this happened in 2019 when I participated in a scientific expedition to Mount Kailash as part of an academic project. I am a geologist, and at the time was working on research on natural geological formations in sacred mountains. I have always been skeptical, someone who seeks logical explanations before believing in mysterious stories. So Mount Kailash was a perfect challenge. Between the reports of rapid aging and magnetic characteristics that many attribute to legends, I was determined to find scientific explanations. When we arrived at base camp, the atmosphere seemed normal, but soon things made me uncomfortable in a way that I could not explain. The first strange thing happened when we started to analyze the terrain. The compasses we took to map the formations were out of regulation, spinning around as if they could not find the north. I thought it was a glitch in the equipment, but other colleagues noticed the same. The temperature seemed to change abruptly. In a matter of minutes, we went from a heat that made the ice melt to a cold that froze at the fingertips, even with gloves. As we walked up to a higher area to study the composition of the snow, we noticed something strange on the ground. Symmetrical marks that included circles and crossed lines, like engravings, but extremely precise. I took pictures, but some of them were blurry, as if something was interfering with the camera. I still tried to ignore it, thinking there was a logical explanation, but a shiver started coming up the spine. As we climbed higher on the trail, I started to notice something peculiar. The air seemed different. It was not only the altitude that made breathing more difficult. It was as if the air had a strange density, almost palpable. My colleagues also apologized, but nobody said anything. It was then that I found an unusual rock formation. It was a large wall of smooth stone, almost like glass, reflecting the sunlight in a way that made no sense in that environment. When I approached work, I noticed small crystals embedded on the surface, forming patterns that are suitable, organized too. It was not natural. My instinct was to back off, but my scientific curiosity was stronger. Passed my hand on the surface, and at that moment I felt a slight static discharge, like a weak shock that ran through my entire arm. The feeling was so strange that I took a step back but kept watching. When one of my colleagues tried to touch the same stone, he immediately backed away, saying that he felt something hot. This made no sense. The stone was covered with ice in some places. We decided to take samples for analysis, but the moment we took a fragment, the wind around it became stronger, as if the mountain was reacting. It was not an ordinary wind. It seemed to carry a low sound, almost like a buzzing, that made my chest vibrate. I looked at Mount Kailash, and for a second, I had the impression that it was shining in a subtle way, a golden light that seemed to pulsate on top. It was then that I began to think that perhaps there was something in that place that could not be explained by science. We keep going up, even with that uncomfortable feeling in the air. The wind carried a sound that seemed distant, as if something or someone was emitting a continuous murmur. Some colleagues complained of headaches, but we attributed it to the altitude. Then I noticed something strange with my watch. He had stopped a few minutes ago, marking exactly 2:14. I looked at the others and realized that their watches were the same, frozen in the same time. That made me uncomfortable, but I still tried to rationalize. Perhaps there was some interference from some magnetic anomaly, something I could explain later with data. However, The idea that Mount Kailash could be affecting us in an inexplicable way started to bother me. We reached a higher point, where the snow was denser and the winds more sharp. The trail leads us to a small plateau with a direct view of the ridge. The view was stunning, but there was something wrong. The light seemed to behave strangely there, as if it was refracting in a way I had never seen. When trying to take pictures, my camera locked again, displaying distorted lines on the screen. It was then that he noticed something peculiar on the ground. The same circular marks we saw before, but this time they were much deeper, almost as if they were made by a machine. When one of my colleagues commented that the marks could be in different positions from where we saw them earlier, my stomach turned. Something was wrong, and it seemed that the mountain was changing. While we analyzed the marks on the floor, I started to feel a slight vibration in my feet. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but soon I realized that others in the group were also noticing. One of the colleagues, visibly clear, said he felt as if the soil was breathing. His words echoed in my mind as I tried to find a logical explanation. The low, steady sound that accompanied the wind now seemed closer, almost like an electronic hum. I took a small measuring device that I always take with me to pick up vibrations, but it didn't record anything. It was as if the characteristics were beyond the reach of our equipment. However we tried to ignore it, the discomfort was evident. I can't help feeling that we weren't welcome there. It was at that moment that I saw something I will never forget. On the horizon near the ridge, a golden light seemed to pulse slowly and steadily. It was not a reflection of the sun or something caused by snow. It was a light that seemed to have its own life, passing in an almost intentional way. Some colleagues even pointed and mumbled, but no one dared to come closer. It was then that the guide of the expedition, who until then had been silent, told us that it was better to go down immediately. His voice was firm, but I could see the fear in his face. That wasn't normal, and he knew it. Before we went down, I looked one last time at the ridge and had the impression that something was moving there, something that should not be there. The descent was quick and silent. No one said a word, but the fear was palpable. Each step seemed heavier, as if the mountain was in our hands. The hum persisted, even with the increasing distance from the summit, and the wind seemed to carry with it a murmur almost inaudible. When we finally reached the base of the camp, the guide asked that they not comment on what we saw or felt during the climb. He stated that certain mysteries of Mount Kailash should not be challenged, and that talking about them could attract unwanted attention. This statement made me even more disturbed, but I decided not to insist. When I reviewed my notes and photos that night, I noticed something even more bizarre. The few images that my registered camera had were corrupted, with strange distortions that ignore forming patterns similar to the marks on the floor. After I came home, I tried to understand what happened that day, but until today I could not find an explanation. Some things I decide not to tell my colleagues, because it would sound insane. For example, the feeling that time stopped while we were on the plateau, or the fact that my feet continued to tingle for days, as if they were still on top of the vibrant mountain soil. Mount Kailash is more than a geological formation. It is a living enigma, a place where logic seems to lose its meaning. And honestly, even with my scientific mind, I don't want to go back to find out more. Sometimes certain mysteries need to remain mysteries. Mount Kailash and ancient civilizations. My name is Eirik, and what I will tell you happened in 2018 during a trip to Tibet as part of an independent archaeological research. Since college, I have always been interested in ancient civilizations and their impressive buildings, but my fascination with Mount Kailash began when I read about the legends that connect it to a so-called city of gods. This theory, that I would have something hidden under the mountain, seemed to me one of those mysteries that would never be solved, but still aroused enough curiosity to make me invest in this expedition. The official goal was to study the geological formations and correlate them with the Kailasa temple in India, another site surrounded by stories about advanced technologies. However, the real motivation was to understand if there was any foundation in the idea of an ancient and technologically advanced civilization linked to Mount Kailash. I arrived at base camp with 4 other researchers, all as intrigued as I am. The place was isolated, surrounded by snow and so absolute silence that you could almost hear your own thoughts. On the morning of the second day, we began our walk towards an area where, according to some old maps and local reports, there may be traces of ancient excavations. The trail was not easy. The thin air makes each step seem like a monumental effort. After a few hours, we reached a plateau with an incredible view of Mount Kailash. It was there that I noticed something strange for the first time. On the floor, there were patterns that showed geometric designs, but not natural. Straight lines, circles, and shapes that reminded symbols of a lost language were engraved on the stones. The solutions were impressive, and I wanted to see how it could have been done in such a remote and challenging location. While we were looking at the inscriptions on the floor, one of the colleagues pointed to something even more curious. There was a large rock with what seemed to be a portal-shaped deep, perfectly symmetrical. It was not something that natural erosion could create, and what made it all the more strange was that the rock looked slightly polished, as if it had been worked by tools. As I approached, I felt a very subtle vibration in the air around that formation. It was almost imperceptible, but it seemed real. I took my notebook to note the observations, and at the same time, I took some photos. However, when reviewing them on camera, I noticed that most were distorted, as if an interference had blurred the images. That was unusual, but not impossible. Even so, the feeling that something out of the ordinary was happening there began to bother me. We continued exploring the area, and the further we got away from base camp, but the atmosphere seemed strange. The absolute silence, which was initially calming, began to rise as an abnormal absence of life. No bird, no wind. Just the sound of our footsteps in the snow. That's when I saw another rock formation, this time with patterns of engravings in high relief. They were extremely made, with shapes that resembled stylized human figures, but with elongated heads and disproportionately long arms. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, trying to understand what I was selling. It didn't seem like something done by an ordinary civilization. An absurd theory crossed my mind. Would it be possible that this had some connection with the legends about the gods of Mount Kailash? I didn't share this thought with anyone at the time, but I felt a shiver that made me question what we were about to find. After exploring the rock formation with the stylized figures, we noticed that the climate began to change rapidly. The sky, which was clear, was made by dense clouds that formed in a matter of minutes. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind finally gave a sign of life, but in a disturbing way. He seemed to circle around us, as if pushing us in the direction we were going. One of the colleagues suggested that we should go back to camp, but he decided to push forward a little further. It was not just stubbornness. There was something pulling me to continue. a kind of instinct that said we were close to discovering something important. The guide, who until then seemed calm, began to show signs of nervousness. He kept looking at Mount Kailash, muttering something he could not understand. After walking for a few more minutes, we arrived at an area that seemed different from anything we had seen before. The terrain was almost flat, without the typical irregularities of a mountain. In the center, there was an opening in the ground, like an entrance to a cave, but it was not natural. The edges were so symmetrical that they were cut by a laser. I knelt to examine it more closely, and then I felt the ground tremble slightly, almost like a pulse. The others also noticed and were in absolute silence, as if they were waiting for something. When I looked inside the opening, all I could see was darkness, but the air that came out of it was different. It was warmer and had a metallic smell like iron. My heart, and for a moment had the feeling that we were shooting to invade something we should not. As we decided what to do about the opening in the ground, the guide took a step back, visibly terrified, and decided to get closer. He said that area was off limits, a place the locals avoided at all costs. It further increased tension in the group. Even hesitating, we decided to use a flashlight to try to see deeper. The light seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, but he could see something reflecting down there, as if there was a shiny metallic surface. It was difficult to judge the depth, but it seemed much deeper than any ordinary cave. When one of the colleagues threw a stone inside, the sound that came back was not expected. It was a hollow metallic echo, almost as if it had been struck by something built. We all exchanged nervous looks. That makes no sense. It was at this moment that the tremor on the ground became stronger. It was not enough to bring us down, but it was clear that it came under the opening. The sound that accompanied the tremor was not natural. It was a humming tune, almost as if giant machines were working down there. My instinct was that we should leave immediately, but at the same time there was an unbearable curiosity to find out what was happening. The guide was late again, insisting that we return, but the rest of the group seemed divided. Then something unexpected happened. A flashlight we were using blinked a few times and completely went out, even with new batteries. At the same instant, the buzzing stopped and absolute silence returned. It was as if everything around us were watching us, waiting for our next move. Without the flashlight and with the tension in the group increasing, we decided that it was time to go back. The guide seemed relieved, but we were divided between curiosity and fear. During the descent, the atmosphere became even more strange. The wind, which before seemed to push us, had disappeared, and the silence was so dense that any sound, the crack of a stone, our footsteps in the snow, seemed amplified. I looked back one last time and saw something that made me freeze. The golden light that always enveloped Mount Kailash was more intense, but now it seemed to pulse at regular intervals like a heart. Don't know if it was my mind playing tricks or if there really was something there, but I had the impression that a huge, undefined shadow was moving towards the mountain. When we finally arrived at base camp, no one talked about what happened. It was as if we were all trying to process what we saw, or maybe trying to forget. When I reviewed my notes and the few photos I could take, I realized that many of them were corrupted, with distortions that only formed geometric patterns, similar to stone engravings. Still don't know what we found that day. If it was a cave, a portal, or something completely different. All I know is that Mount Kailash holds secrets that we should never have tried to uncover. Even today, when I think of that trembling and the metallic sound coming from the ground, I feel a shiver that makes me question what really exists on that mountain. Experiences of climbers with the defenses of Mount Kailash. My name is Patrick, and what I will tell happened in 2017 when I participated in an expedition to Mount Kailash. Since my youth, I have always been passionate about mountaineering, had climbed several challenging mountains around the world, including Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua, but Mount Kailash was different. Not because he was a demanding technician, but because of the aura of mystery that surrounded him. The mountain, considered sacred by various cultures, there was never official climbing. At least there were no stories of strange events in relation to those who desired. Our team knew this, but we decided that at least we will explore as much of the base and its surroundings as possible. Although we respected the traditions, we were a skeptical group, more interested in geography and the challenges of the terrain. We arrived at base camp on a cold but sunny morning with clear skies. The view of Mount Kailash was breathtaking. Its snow-covered slopes shone in the sun, and the almost geometric shape of the mountain was impressive. Everything seemed normal until early afternoon, when we started exploring the surroundings. The equipment worked well, but as we approached a higher area, some members of the group complained of discomfort. First were mild headaches, which seemed normal by the altitude. But soon one of the climbers, Chris, became pale and began to tremble, even though he was well wrapped. He said that he felt something wrong, a kind of pressure in his chest, as if the air around him was heavy. Initially, we thought it was just the tiredness or the cold, but that seemed different from everything we have experienced. We decided to take a break to assess Chris's situation, but the mood changed suddenly. The clear sky gave way to heavy and dark clouds that formed almost instantly. This was not unusual in the mountains, but the speed with which it happened left us baffled. A strong wind began to blow, cold and sharp, and seemed to come in all directions. As we tried to stabilize the tents, I noticed that my compass was spinning wildly. It was not a technical problem, because other colleagues said the same thing. This made us anxious, but the worst was yet to come. One of the team members, Mark, who was a little further down the trail, called for help. When we ran to him, we found his hands covered in blood. He said that he tried to lean on a rock that looked stable, but it simply moved in a way that he could not explain. By this time, the tension in the group was palpable. Chris, who was already weakened, started vomiting and insisted that we needed to get down. His skin was so pale it was almost gray, and he kept mumbling that he felt something looking at us. We tried to keep him calm while we decided what to do. It was then that I noticed something strange on the ground near where we were. The marks left by the wind had never formed specific patterns, almost perfect circles and lines that intersect in a geometric way. That did not seem to be a coincidence. When I tried to shoot, the camera simply stuck, displaying an error message that I had never seen before. Even being a logical person, at that moment I felt a shiver ran through my spine. It was as if Mount Kailash was warning us not to advance further. After what happened with Chris and Mark, we decided it would be better to return to base camp to rearrange things and assess the group's situation. But as we went down, it seemed that the mountain made a point of hindering our way. The wind was still strong and unpredictable, never playing against our faces, and the terrain seemed to have changed. The trails we used to climb were no longer where we should be. At some points, rocks that were solid before now became unstable, forcing us to look for alternative routes. The feeling of being lost was overwhelming, even with GPS and maps in hand. The local guide who accompanied us, an experienced man and familiar with the region, seemed increasingly restless. He was constantly looking at the top of Mount Kailash, as if he expected something to come out of it. The situation got worse when one of the equipment started to emit strange signals. Our altitude monitor, which always worked well, began to oscillate without reason, indicating absurd numbers, as if we were going up and down at the same time. While we tried to understand what was happening, a peculiar sound took over the air. It was a low, continuous hum that seemed to come from Mount Kailash itself. It was not the sound of wind or any natural appearance we had heard. Chris, who was already weak, began to cry, saying he could not breathe anymore. I tried to carry it, but still the feeling of being offered did not abandon us. It was as if the mountain had life of its own and was actively repelling us. For the first time in years of climbing, I feel real fear, the one that paralyzes and makes you question every decision. As we continued down, the buzzing seemed to get more intense. It was not something you heard only with your ears. It was as if the sound resonated inside the body, crossing the chest and making even concentration difficult. Mark, who was still with his hands hurt, tripped over a rock that seemed to be fixed, but suddenly slipped out of place, almost as if it had moved alone. This made us stop again, and everyone started discussing the possibility of camping where we were and waiting for dawn. But the idea of spending the night there, with that sound and the sudden changes in the environment, seemed even more terrifying. The guide, who was usually a calm and assertive man, was visibly shaken. He suggested that we did our best to get down, even if it meant splitting up into small groups. The decision was made, and I followed Chris and Mark as the guide accompanied the others. The trail seemed more hostile with each step. At one point, we felt a tremor on the ground. It was not strong enough to bring us down, but it was impossible to ignore. Chris, who was increasingly weakened, began to murmur something about having seen a huge shadow pass quickly among the rocks above us. When I looked in that direction, I saw nothing, but the feeling that we were being followed was undeniable. Further on, the snow around us seemed to have strange patterns, as if someone had walked in circles before us, but without leaving footprints that lead somewhere. It was as if we were stuck in a place that did not want to let us go, and each attempt to return seemed draining, both physically and mentally. After hours of fighting against the terrain and cold, we finally saw the lights of base camp. It was a temporary break because the tinnitus persisted and Chris seemed on the verge of collapse. When we arrived, the guide and the other group were already there, but something seemed wrong. They sat in silence, looking at Mount Kailash as if hypnotized. The guide looked at us with a mixture of collapse and fear, saying only, "You felt it, didn't you?" No one answered, but the silence of the group was a sufficient response. We checked the equipment, and that's when you realized that all records of the day were damaged. The photos we took were distorted, with light spots that did not make sense, and even GPS data indicate paths we never followed. It was as if the mountain had erased our attempts to document what happened. The next morning, the weather was incredibly calm, almost as if the mountain were mocking us. Chris was taken to a local hospital to treat the symptoms, and the rest of us decided to end the expedition. To this day, I cannot explain what happened that day. It was as if Mount Kailash were alive, rejecting our presence. The tremors, the sound, the disorientation, everything seemed perfectly orchestrated to push us away. I never believed in my legends or supernatural forces, but that experience changed perspective. I don't know what is on that mountain, but I'm sure it holds something beyond our comprehension. And, honestly, I have no interest in finding out anymore. Government ban on climbing Mount Kailash. My name is Alexander, and what I will tell happened in 2016 during a trip to Tibet. I am an amateur climber and have always been fascinated by mountains with enigmatic stories. Mount Kailash was an obsession of mine since I learned about the 1980 Chinese ban. The idea that no one had climbed that sacred and mysterious peak puzzled me more than anything else. I knew that technically it was not allowed to try a climb, but my intention was not to go to the top. I just wanted to explore the surroundings and understand why so many strange stories surrounded the place. After months of planning and some local connections, I managed to get to base camp with two friends who shared the same curiosity. At first, everything seemed quiet. The day was clear, the air cold but bearable, and Mount Kailash stood imposing in front of us, its geometric shape almost impossible for something natural. We decided to explore a trail that led to an area where, according to rumors, ancient climbers had reported strange phenomena before the ban. After 2 hours of walking, we noticed that the silence around us was absolute, as if the sound had been sucked out of the environment. No wind, no animal, only the sound of our steps in the snow. Then one of my friends, Dmitri, stopped abruptly and pointed to the ground. There were marks in the snow, but they were not common footprints. They were circular shapes, perfectly symmetrical, that seemed to form a continuous pattern. It was not something you would expect to see on a remote mountain. That left us puzzled, but we kept going on, trying to ignore the shiver that was beginning to form. As we continued up the trail, the surrounding atmosphere seemed to get heavier. It was not just physical fatigue. There was something in the air that made it difficult even to think clearly. The absolute silence persisted, and somehow it made everything seem even more surreal. At one point, Sergei, our other friend, pointed to a nearby rock that had a strange glow. When we approached, we saw that it was not a reflection of the sunlight. The surface of the stone had a kind of metallic coating that looked polished, something completely out of place on such a remote mountain. Dmitri tried to touch the rock, but he retreated immediately, saying that he felt a weak static discharge. We both laughed, trying to ease the tension, but something in that stone made me deeply uneasy. After a few more minutes of walking, we reached a small opening between the rocks. The local guide, who had been silent until then, asked us not to go any further. He seemed nervous, constantly looking at Mount Kailash as if he was expecting something to happen. We decided to ignore his warning and entered the opening, which led us into a wider and snowy area. That's when things started to get really weird. The marks in the snow that we had noticed before were now everywhere, forming patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like writing. We tried to record it with our cameras, but all locked or turned off at the same time, even with full batteries. It was the first time we felt that maybe we were dealing with something we couldn't understand, something we definitely didn't want to be documented. While we tried to understand what was happening with the cameras, a peculiar sound began to echo through the area. It was not the sound of wind or rolling stones, but something more serious, almost like a hum that seemed to come from inside the mountain. Sergei stopped and looked around, clearly disturbed. "This is not normal," he muttered, but no one replied. The sound seemed to be involving us, as if Mount Kailash itself was breathing. Dmitri suggested that we should go back immediately, but something inside me wanted to continue. It was not courage. It was as if something was drawing us to move on, despite the fear. As we approached a larger rock formation, we realized that there was something carved into the stone, symbols that none of us could identify. They shone lightly, as if illuminated from the inside, but there was no apparent source of light. It was at this point that Sergei began to feel ill. He said his chest felt tight, and his vision was beginning to blur. We decided it was better to take a break and try to assess the situation. Meanwhile, the local guide seemed increasingly terrified, repeatedly saying that we had gone too far. He refused to look directly at Mount Kailash, as if he was afraid of something that only he could see. Dmitry tried to use the GPS to check our location, but the device was also out of order. The data appeared distorted, showing coordinates that did not make sense. It was there that I realized we were completely on our own, in a place that clearly did not want our presence. We decided that we couldn't ignore Sergei's condition and started to slowly descend. But it seemed like the mountain was against us. The terrain, once stable, now looked treacherous, with loose stones and snow that sank deeper than normal. Dmitry led the way, but stopped every few steps to look around as if trying to find his bearings. I had never seen him so restless. By this time, Sergei was practically being carried, his breathing heavy and irregular. He began to murmur something that at first seemed meaningless, but then we realized that he repeated a word in Russian, Zashita, defense. Dmitry and I looked at each other, trying to understand, but neither of us said anything. It was as if even discussing what was happening was a risk. At a point further down, we heard the sound of the hum again. This time it seemed louder, almost tangible, and seemed to come from all sides. We stopped to try to locate the source, but the sound simply dissipated, leaving an even more disturbing silence. It was when we noticed that the marks in the snow had reappeared, but now they were in different positions. They were not common footprints or tracks. They were the same circular and symmetrical patterns we saw at the beginning, but much larger, as if something gigantic had passed by there. The local guide, who was a few meters back, refused to continue. He said we needed to leave immediately, but something in the way he spoke made me feel that he knew more than he was saying. We rushed, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Each step seemed to bring us closer to something we could not see, but that was clearly there. After a tense and exhausting descent, we finally saw the base camp, but the feeling of relief was brief. Sergei was visibly worse, with almost gray skin, and seemed disoriented. When we arrived, the guide looked at us with an expression that mixed fear and relief. He murmured something in Tibetan to himself, almost like a prayer, and refused to explain what had happened up there. While we were trying to stabilize Sergei, I realized that the photos I took were completely corrupted. Some showed unexplained distortions and light spots, while others seemed to have been erased. Dmitry's GPS, which he finally managed to restart, showed that we had been walking in circles for almost an hour, although we were sure that we were going straight. The silence in the camp was as heavy as the mountain, and no one wanted to discuss what we had experienced. The next morning, Sergei was taken to the nearest hospital where doctors said he seemed to have suffered the effects of a much higher altitude than we actually were. The rest of us decided to end the expedition and go home. To this day, I can't explain what happened that day. Mount Kailash is more than a mountain, it's a presence. Something there is beyond our comprehension, something that does not want to be disturbed. I always heard that the 1980 ban was out of respect for traditions, but now I wonder if it was more than that. Perhaps it is a form of protection, both for us and for whatever is stored on that mountain. Since then, I have never climbed a mountain. Some experiences are enough to remind me that there are places where logic is not welcome.